I remember just through my clinical trial experience, it ended very abruptly, and I didn't know what my next steps were or how I was going to continue going on this medication. And so that left me, feeling very isolated and alone, and like, wow, I really did just feel like a number in this clinical trial. However, I realized my impact once I saw the drug going public and how it was impacting my community in such a positive way. I am still celebrated by my community members when they hear that I was on the clinical trial for that particular drug. They're like, wow, like that's amazing, and they want to know more. And so this is where it goes back to really making the individual who's open to participating in a clinical trial, celebrating them.
Hi, my name is Debbie. I'm a patient experience strategist working with Merakoi, and I've been working with them for about 4.5 years on patient insights and co-design projects. And I'm here with Ashley.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. I am Ashley, and I have been living with atopic dermatitis, and I am a patient advocate who's just really looking to shed light on the patient experience and how we can better engage pharma with patients like myself in a meaningful way throughout research and development.
The reason that Ashley and I are speaking today is we wanted to have an open conversation about some key challenges faced by teams in the pharmaceutical industry. So, for example, scientific communication, medical affairs, ClinOps, some very specific challenges that we have worked on projects together to address, but also that we have heard from multiple client teams as well. And the two key challenges we wanted to talk about today were around patient experience in clinical trials, so recruitment, retention, and the actual patient experience, and then also how patients across disease areas find new information about treatments, new clinical data, how they sort of find, discuss, and share that. And we'll start with the last one first. One of the things that I found really interesting, so Ashley, you and I have worked on a project previously around how patients with atopic dermatitis find new information, find new clinical data, find new treatment information. And what I found really interesting was it seemed like there was a gap. For other disease areas that I've worked in, for instance, in the cancer space or in ulcerative colitis, it seemed like there was more information coming through to the patient. So, for instance, there would be patients with cancer who would attend conferences, and then they would bring that information back on new treatments and new clinical data, and they would almost translate that for the patients. Like, what does this mean for patients? What's coming? Who could this benefit and how? And also, it seemed like patients in that space read more in terms of scientific publications. They would just dive in and kind of get stuck in. And there is a steep learning curve, but it was something that was commonly done in the ulcerative colitis space. I heard that a lot of patients sort of followed physicians on Twitter, now X, and other social media platforms and sort of engaged with them, or they would have webinars set up by their patient communities. This didn't seem to be happening in the atopic dermatitis community. So I wanted to ask you, first of all, do you think this is still a gap?
I definitely do think that there's still a gap when it comes to streamlining information like scientific data back to the community. There's just no process right now. And that is one of the many challenges that our community is facing right now, which is this limited awareness to scientific data and limited access to reliable sources that would really support us in understanding what is happening in the atopic dermatitis space. And so there's many other things, including barriers to obstacles to join clinical trials and opportunities in that space. But there's definitely still a gap.
And maybe for a few minutes, we can spend some time talking about how to address that gap. I mean, it could be specific to atopic dermatitis, but obviously it could be across diseases as well. When there is new clinical data, most pharmaceutical companies now, they create these lay summaries, right? But they don't actively promote them because they're highly regulated and they can't be seen talking to patients directly about products that are not approved for the market yet. However, if no one knows the lay summaries exist, then they're not going to ask for them. It just
Right.
doesn't happen. So I wonder how high the uptake could even be on those those types of things. But patients would be interested if they knew, correct? I mean, they would be interested to read the lay summary if they knew it exists.
Exactly. And that's where it really comes down to multiple things. Like there's health literacy. And so being able to partner up with individuals like myself or organizations that are, patient focused to really create some type of resource and opportunity for people to learn about lay summaries and to learn what certain things mean so that we can really support with promoting just knowledge and awareness around new treatment options and opportunities for our community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important as well to kind of look at how the information comes out now. So normally physicians are prioritized, right? So new data, for instance, new clinical data is presented at congresses. And then sometimes the physicians will have access to the clinical trial investigator. So the person who's leading the clinical trial will speak directly to physicians and they will translate this data into what does this mean for your clinical practice? But then this doesn't really trickle down into the patient's sort of space, right? They're unaware of all of these conversations that are happening until the product is approved. And understandably, there is a regulatory sort of barrier, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of direct communication with patients. But at the same time, physicians are also involved in that. So is that something as well that like physicians should be more empowered to talk to patients directly about what's coming?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, doctors have a very specific connection with their patients, right? And they have such a unique opportunity in the moments of having an appointment with somebody living with atopic dermatitis to share new information and new treatment options that are coming out, but to also provide the patients with educational material that they can take home and read and, really do their own work and responsibility in understanding what is taking place. And so doctors and healthcare providers just have such a unique opportunity to really meet patients where they're at. And there's definitely a gap still there in my experience.
Yeah. And I mean, understandably, some people may not see their treating physician, 2 or 3 times a year, right? And you do have limited time. I know in my own situation, I see, well, my appointments are now virtual appointments. So, and I managed to get 4 of those a year, and they're probably 10 to 15 minutes max. So it's understandable that doctors may not, in that moment where they are having that interaction with the patient, they may not think to talk about new treatments that are coming out, or especially for people with moderate to severe atopic dermatitis, you would think those should be sort of almost front of mind as well.
Absolutely. And this is where partnering up with patient advocacy organizations, for example, like the National Eczema Association or JEPR, the Global Parents for Eczema Research, they are a great hub to be able to share this information back to the community, whether it be through their social media channels or even their newsletters. They are constantly updating the community as best as they can, but I'm sure there can still be a better way to streamline that information directly to the patient.
And do you know if those organizations are organizing webinars with, say, atopic dermatitis specialists or people who are bringing that new information to the wider community? Is that something that's being organized now?
Yeah, I do see that, webinars, doctor patient webinars taking place, especially with the National Eczema Association. However, something that I believe is still in the gap is being able to really promote that within the community so that there's a larger audience who's attending these webinars and being able to partner up with not just somebody like myself, but even, for instance, many communities who are a part of those communities and who can really just share the knowledge and information in these webinars. I feel like there's still a better way to streamline that process to get information back to the community.
Yes, almost like a mini community of like champions. They use
Yeah.
that terminology a lot with physicians. They want to
Yeah.
have people that sort of champion information to transport that back to. So if you are working at a teaching hospital, for instance, and you go to a conference, if you can be that champion and bring everything back, then you're serving a greater purpose, right? You're disseminating that information. Webinars can be quite tricky as well because 60 minutes or or longer or even shorter, not everyone wants to sort of dive into that. And participating sometimes feels a bit intimidating for people
Yeah.
to be like put on the spotlight asking questions, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. So how can we help break that down as well? Like the webinar probably has great information, but maybe it's a bit too much for everyone.
Absolutely. And this is where just bringing it back to partnering up with patient advocates who are active in the community, especially on online platforms like myself on Instagram. I would love to take information from those webinars, and make it so that it's understandable to the audience. Like, okay, here's a 15-second snippet of X, Y, and Z. I would love to just share that back to the community so that they can receive that and fully understand what is happening. Oftentimes in these webinars, it's so filled with information and it could be very overwhelming for anybody listening in or watching. But what do you do afterwards with that information is just as important. So, making sure that there is a way to break all of that information down and all of those great snippets and being able to share it back to the community in a digestible way.
Yeah, absolutely. Making everything sort of succinct and digestible and also visual. We're all, especially if you're going to go on Instagram or TikTok or, any of those social media channels where they're sort of focused on visual presentation of information and sort of the energy around videos and stories and things like that. I think it's really important that you bring some of that energy and life from the webinar into those formats.
Absolutely. And as a patient advocate, like I have the responsibility to ensure that any information that I'm sharing is accurate and reliable. And so I still feel like there is a gap between being able to better understand certain terminology and language behind some of these medical terms and what is taking place. So I would even love more of that support to be able to share that information to my community that is reliable and accurate.
I think you touched on something really important as well, is that the internet is a little bit like the Wild West of healthcare as well, right? And so there's a lot of misinformation. I've heard it from patient consultants like yourself, where they have run across misinformation and they've sort of flagged that in communities. And I think the communities, closed communities, tend to do a pretty good job of policing bad information, but just the wider kind of social media, no one polices Instagram in terms of just misinformation. And also, just because something works for one person doesn't mean it works for everyone. And so I think you're right. It needs to be sort of that scientifically credible information. And this is where the pharmaceutical industry is so strong. It's like they are the science behind all of these treatments, right? And so I feel like they need to have a voice, but I do understand sort of the hesitancy of this sort of direct line of communication. But I think we've already sort of flagged quite a few opportunities in the space of getting the information directly to patients via different avenues. And so I think, hopefully that will be helpful to some people who are watching this video.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are the trusted sources of information for our communities. And so it's almost like, please depend on us, like use us, be with us and support us in better channeling all of this information back to our communities. We want to share this information with our community and we're asking for support. And what better way to get that support from pharmaceutical companies who have that information and can support us in breaking down the language and the barriers so that we can better understand and therefore better share that information back with our community.
So should we move on to the clinical trial experience? Because I
Yeah.
know you have your own personal experience participating in clinical trials, and I want to explore a little bit more because a few things that clients have told me recently is that they feel like that patients don't even really understand what a clinical trial is, what it's like to participate in one. And so even getting through that first hurdle of recruitment sometimes can be super challenging for teams working in the pharmaceutical industry because they're trying to reach an audience that doesn't understand what they're buying, more or less. Would you
Yeah.
say that's true as well?
100%. I mean, I am somebody who joined a clinical trial back in 2015, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And so I wish I would have had somebody who looked like me, who had experience going through a clinical trial to share with me that information so that I could feel more supported at that time and know, okay, this is what I'm getting into. And now I have a level of confidence to go and almost like enjoy the process too while I'm there because I fully understand what is taking place. And so there's definitely a gap between just clinical trial opportunities and where patients are at, and being able to merge that will be huge in our community, especially coming from diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key point you said is someone like you. It's also feeling prepared, isn't it? So
Yeah.
if you have someone who is telling you this is what it's like to actually be in a clinical trial, like this is the process, you have to spend a day there. You're going to need to fill out information. And some of those things I also wanted to discuss. It's like, how do we make that process less burdensome as well, so that actually when people are talking about what it's like to be in a clinical trial, it's more positive. It's not like, oh, you're going to have to, take off work for an entire day every time you have a treatment because you've got to do this, this, and this when you get there, and then you have the treatment, and then you've still got to fill out more paperwork. You know, that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Is making that experience better for patients.
Absolutely. And I really think it goes back to setting the expectations and who is setting the expectations. And if individuals interested in clinical trials, if they have questions, who do they go to? And I think this is where, at least on my side as a patient advocate, I'm not seeing enough success stories out there of real people talking about their real experience going through a clinical trial. And I think once people start hearing that and seeing that and saying, hey, she found success in going through a clinical trial, maybe that's the case for me. Like, then we start opening up people to become more open and curious about clinical trials and being able to just really merge that gap.
Yeah. And someone that I love working with, who works in the medical affairs space, recently said to me, patients who go into clinical trials are superheroes, but they don't always feel like it. And we don't, as an industry, even recognize them as being unique or special, that they're not only are they doing something that is almost selfless, and sometimes they're doing it sort of in a place of desperation where they've run out of options in standard of care, but also they're paving the way for others who come after them, who won't have to go through the same treatment path that they've gone through. But the industry as a whole doesn't really recognize people that, and they certainly don't make them, from what I've heard, they don't make them feel special or sort of like champions in that clinical trial setting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember just through my clinical trial experience, it ended very abruptly, and I didn't know what my next steps were or how I was going to continue going on this medication. And so that left me, feeling very isolated and alone, and like, wow, I really did just feel like a number in this clinical trial. However, I realized my impact once I saw the drug going public and how it was impacting my community in such a positive way. I am still celebrated by my community members when they hear that I was on the clinical trial for that particular drug. They're like, wow, like that's amazing, and they want to know more. And so this is where it goes back to really making the individual who's open to participating in a clinical trial, celebrating them, like you said. I know there's this one individual who shared with me that one company threw like a party after the clinical trial to celebrate all of the participants who joined in. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Like, that's what we need each and every time so that we can encourage and empower people to participate in clinical trials moving forward.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you had other ideas, because for cancer patients, you probably have seen like advertisements on television or something where they ring the bell when they finish treatment, right? And it's empowering, and it's sort of moving, and it makes that experience memorable. I've finished my treatment. I mark that by ringing the bell. But what are other ways do you think that the industry could help sort of celebrate those moments with patients?
That's a fantastic question. And everybody knows about the ringing the bell when it
Mhm.
comes to cancer patients. And like you said, it's so memorable. And so, how can we create just a similar experience for anybody going through a clinical trial? I mean, there's multiple things that, you know, people can do and pharma can do to really help the patient feel special, whether it be a celebration at the end where you get to meet other people who also went through the clinical trial. Is it a photo shoot? Is it some type of partnership so that we have, or the participant has, the information to share it back to their communities? There's just multiple ways to acknowledge somebody who has gone through a clinical trial experience and who has risked a lot of their time and health in making something happen. And so I think that's still an open question that we can figure out. But I think there's just so many great ways to acknowledge somebody who has gone through a clinical trial experience.
Yeah, and that's what's great about working with small communities of patient consultants like yourself, is that we ideate and brainstorm around all of these
Right.
possibilities, and just some sort of remove some of the barriers during our working sessions so that the great ideas come to the front. And then, I mean, obviously we would like for all of the ideas to be implemented, but it's not always possible. But I think just having some ideas to put forward to the industry. Like I remember reading a story about a clinical trial where kids had to go into that radiography machine. I don't know what it's the one where you have to go in,
Yeah.
and it's quite intimidating for kids. And so what they did at this particular trial site was they turned it into like a sort of a jungle room, like almost like a playroom, so that when
Oh,
kids went in, they weren't so scared. Or if they are afraid of, getting blood drawn, they try to make it into more of like a game or something fun. And I think, more of that kind of thinking needs to go into the clinical trial experience overall. I mean, some of it is just removing some of the burden. So allowing people to, pre-fill forms or do some of the work at home that they could submit electronically, and just giving them some of their time back. But it's also, things that I think you have said in the past, like around, being around transparency as well. Just making, who do you go to for help? Who else is in the trial? How do I find out information? Just some of the basics, I think, still need to be improved a bit.
absolutely. And there's multiple ideas as you were talking, Debbie, that came up. And it's really not just about celebrating a person at the end
Mm.
of the clinical trial. It's about how can we celebrate and acknowledge and meet people where they're at throughout the entire journey of participating in a clinical trial. And I know in past conversations we've talked about potentially providing food and lunch for those individuals who are going to a clinical site for like 2, 3, 4+ hours in their day? Is it providing blankets? Because sometimes these offices and areas can be super cold. Is it providing support with transportation? And so there are different ways throughout that process that we can acknowledge and celebrate and support every individual going through a clinical trial.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's still a lot that can be done in that space, and it benefits everyone. So it benefits the people participating, but it also benefits the industry, because if more people understood that this was a positive and rewarding experience, not just from a treatment and, outcomes perspective, but actually that the experience itself was something a little bit different to their clinic experience. Do you know what I mean? Like you go to your clinic and you have your treatment and you see your doctor, but this is sort of taking you outside of that space. And if people could kind of understand that world a little bit better, and that it's a positive and rewarding world for them to be in, and a safe world and all of that, and they're looked after and their needs are met, and like you said, their transportation needs, or if they're or if it's a cold inside the clinic, that they're given blankets and a healthy snack, then more people, I think, would be willing to try them.
Absolutely. And it goes back to how is this information being shared back to those communities? And again, having people who have gone through the experience who looks like the community to share their experience and to encourage and empower individuals to just be curious and open to what that can look like moving forward.
So just to close, anyone who has watched the full video, if you want to improve patient communications around clinical data or new treatments, If you want to improve patient experiences in clinical trials, then work with Merakoi. We have amazing groups of patient consultants, and we put them together into mini communities and work together to come up with amazing ideas, do content creation, solution design, insights projects, obviously. And it's so rewarding because you get to work with people like Ashley, which makes my job wonderful anyway, as a strategist, and just bringing in the patient voice in a continuous dialogue throughout your project.
Just thank you, Debbie. Thank you to the Merakoi team for always thinking of us and including us in these really important engagements and partnerships. It takes organizations like yourself to really bridge that gap and change the future of what it looks like to live, at least in my case, with atopic dermatitis.
Great. Thank you so much.